In today's video, we're going to talk about two of the most influential scientists in history, Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking. One of them believed in God, while the other supported atheism. We'll try to figure out whose viewpoint makes more sense. We'll also discuss whether there's really any conflict between religion and science. Plus, I'll share what some of the greatest scientists of all time have actually written about God, something you might not often hear about. It's not shown up front, but to understand that writing, we first need to grasp a few other things. After watching today's video all the way through, you'll discover not just science, but even yourself in a whole new way. So let's get started. About 10 years ago, I came across a book called The 100 Ranking of the Most Influential Persons in History. Basically, it's a list of 100 people throughout human history who were born on this planet and deeply influenced and changed the world. The book was written by author Michael H. Hart. I picked it up just out of curiosity to know the names of those 100 people. But I was a bit surprised when I saw the top 3 names on the list. Michael H. Hart named Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the most influential person in world history and placed Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, whom Christians call Jesus Christ, in 3rd place. But my attention was caught by the name in 2nd place. Music, Isaac Newton. Even today, if you ask any scientist, many people casually acknowledge Isaac Newton as the most influential scientist ever. Just as many say, the author of this book also calls Newton the greatest scientist of all time. Both Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Jesus Christ brought the Word of God to the world. On the other hand, Newton brought a revolutionary change to modern science that gave us the ability to see the world in a whole new way. In this book, the author mainly explains why Newton is so important. The greatest scientist of all time. What were his contributions? How did he change the entire world with his discoveries? From here, you can learn a lot about the scientist Newton. But there's not much idea about Newton the person. However, recently, after reading 2 books by Professor Robb published by Oxford University Press, I discovered a different side of Newton, one who was deeply philosophical and religious. The 2 books are Priest of Nature and Newton, a very short introduction. Newton was born to a farming family. In the family, Newton's dad was a farmer who couldn't even write his own name. As a kid, Newton was very small and sickly. People thought he probably wouldn't survive. His father died a few months before Newton was born. Later, Newton's mom got. After her second husband passed away, Newton's mom took him out of school. Her plan was to make Newton a farmer, to have him take care of their land and property. But Newton had neither the talent nor the interest for farming. So he went back to school. That boy later became a groundbreaking scientist known for his amazing contributions to mathematics, physics, and optics. Music, his discoveries didn't just change the world, they helped humanity reach the moon. Newton had studied a lot of philosophy. Whether it was Aristotle or Descartes, he read them all deeply. He kept a notebook where he jotted down various notes on Aristotle's philosophy, especially on ethics, logic, rhetoric, and natural philosophy. Around the age of 22, Newton wrote a new headline in that notebook. Join in. Certain philosophical questions were making him think. Those of you who have been following my channel for a while probably know that here, we discuss various philosophers' ideas from time to time. Socrates had a student named Plato, and Plato's student was Aristotle. We know that Aristotle learned a lot from his teacher Plato, but at the same time, he disagreed with Plato on many points. There's a famous quote attributed to Aristotle. Plato is my friend, but truth is a greater friend. When Newton wrote the title Certain Philosophical Questions, he also jotted down something very similar underneath. Plato is my friend. Aristotle is my friend, but truth is a greater friend. It's amazing to think how influential Plato and Aristotle were that even about 2,000 years after their deaths, a monumental genius like Newton was still reflecting on them. But the person who had the deepest impact on Newton's philosophy of life was Jesus Christ. That is to say, Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. Although Newton was a Christian, he didn't believe in Christianity's main idea, the Holy Trinity. In other words, while Christians see Jesus Christ as God, Newton didn't accept that. According to him, the way Christians describe God isn't correct, and Jesus didn't teach that. Newton believed that many things were added to the Bible later, on that weren't there originally. So in his view, Christianity became corrupted. That's why he wanted to know what Jesus' real teachings were. He spent a lot of time searching. That's why Newton devoted much more time to religious studies than to scientific research. Besides, the role Newton played as a scientist was something he actually saw more as a religious role than a scientific one. He believed that the Creator had established a divine order and design in the universe. As a scientist, he was trying to figure out what that order and design actually were. Newton believed that the Creator had given him the ability to know and understand the truth. He was given special powers, and that's why he thought of himself as someone really special. That strong confidence in himself later brought him unprecedented success. Newton published a groundbreaking book in the history of science called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, often shortened to or just. By the way, natural philosophy basically means science. Newton's discovery is considered the mathematical foundation of classical physics. From this, we get the laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation. Honestly, it's really hard for someone like me sitting here to fully grasp just how huge an achievement this was. Many believe Newton basically cracked the code of the universe. It brought a revolutionary change to our understanding of the universe. In the last video, we talked about how, from the Renaissance period up to the 20th century, Christianity in Europe faced one challenge after another. Music, Renaissance humanism, the Protestant Reformation, secularization, the scientific revolution. The Industrial Revolution and the philosophy of the European Enlightenment period both posed new challenges to Christianity. Gradually, the importance of religion in people's personal lives and in the state started to decline in Europe. The philosophy of the European Enlightenment was mainly based on the idea that human reason, that is, the ability to think logically, should be given the highest priority and that there's really no need for religion. This is what we mean by modernity in philosophy. When we talk about modernity in philosophy, this is what it refers to. The secular approach to knowledge means explaining everything based on human reasoning and scientific methods. No need for God here. To prove that human thinking ability or human reasoning is enough, they often used examples like Newton's and optics. In other words, they pointed to Newton's work to show what humans are capable of and what they can achieve. Some people even went as far as saying that Newton should be for his discoveries. So using Newton's discoveries, a lot of people have said, look, we've figured out how the universe works. We understand the laws of nature. We don't need God. There is no God. But the guy who actually discovered the master key to the universe, Newton himself, was deeply religious. When he came up with the law of gravity, he never said, now we don't need God. Instead, he said what an amazing, wise, and powerful God it must be to design the system so perfectly. Since the universe has such beautiful laws, there has to be a lawgiver. And music, that's that. The giver is God. If you pick up Newton's groundbreaking book and look at the end, you'll find a section called the General Scholium. Or if you just search General Scholium on Google, you'll find that part where Newton clearly talks about his views on the Creator. I'll read you some short excerpts from there. But these bodies do indeed persevere in their orbits by the mere law of gravity, yet they could by no means. At first glance, Newton says the regular positions of the orbits themselves come from those laws. That is, the sun and planets orbiting can be explained by the law of gravity. In other words, once a planet is already in its orbit, gravity can explain its motion. But the problem is, how did the planets get to those initial positions in the first place? That's not because of gravity. Or why exactly did they end up in those exact spots? What's the purpose behind that? That purpose, what philosophy calls the final cause. You can't explain that with gravity. Simply put, laws just describe behavior. Laws don't have any creative power. Here, a purely philosophical question comes up. Music, so, can an analogy help us understand this? Think about a chessboard and the pieces, how each piece moves. If the board and pieces already exist, then we can predict the game using the rules. But who created the board and pieces? That can't be explained by the rules of chess. Also, you see chess. Just knowing the rules of the game doesn't automatically create the chessboard and pieces. And the question remains, where did the rules come from or who made them? Similarly, physics describes how the universe behaves, explaining how it actually works. Laws can't create something out of nothing. They don't have any creative power. So laws are just descriptions of behavior, not the cause of it. So we understand that laws don't have the power to create anything. Instead, they describe whatever is happening in this universe. There's a regularity to it all. Nothing just appears out of nowhere. Remember that famous Latin phrase, ex fit, which means nothing comes from nothing. So, who ultimately created everything? The answer is God created everything through His will and power. In other words, nothing just happens on its own. It's all because of God's will and power. Keep this in mind, the will and power of God. Another important philosophical point we need to understand is that nothing can create something by itself. So let's go. Let's see what Newton wrote. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. In other words, Newton is saying that this amazing solar system with the sun and planets could only come from a wise and powerful existence. You can see that here Newton is acknowledging the existence of a creator, and by doing so, he is personally rejecting atheism. Just take a closer look here at Newton. He's not just talking about the sun and the planets. He's talking about the whole system. In other words, the system that runs everything was created by God. Since God is the creator of the system, he's not bound by it. If he wants, God can perform miracles or supernatural events. Professor Robb described Newton's view of God like this in his book. His God was a very real being who created the universe by an act of will, was intimately connected to it at all times, and occasionally intervened to change human history and the cosmos at large. So, according to Newton, God created the universe by his will. It's not like he just created it and then left us alone. God is always connected with this universe, and he can intervene whenever he wants. In other words, the natural laws we see don't have to run everything all the time. Sometimes, God has done things that change the course of human history and the universe. Music, so according to Newton, God has the power to change anything anytime if he wants. All right, let's go back to Newton's general scholium and take a look there. What Newton is saying is, all things are not the soul of the world, but the Lord over all. Many people say that the Creator is the soul of this universe, that he is mixed within everything, that this universe is God, or that nature is God. But Newton is saying you can't really say something like that. The idea that the universe is God is called pantheism. So Newton is rejecting pantheism. Newton continues, and on account of his dominion, he is one to be called Lord God or universal ruler. Okay, here a word is used. God it. Don't get confused when you see. Normally, when we use the word won't, it has an apostrophe, meaning will not. But here, there's no apostrophe, so actually means usually, commonly, or normally. Another new word here might be. It's a Greek word that means almighty, all-powerful, or the universal ruler. Basically, Newton is saying that because of God's all-encompassing power, we usually call him almighty or universal ruler. Newton also writes that from his true dominion, it follows that the true God is a living, intelligent, and powerful being. And from his other perfections, that he is supreme or most perfect, eternal and infinite, omnipotent and omniscient. That means his existence stretches from eternity to eternity, his presence from infinity to infinity. In other words, Newton is saying the true God is a living, wise, and powerful being. He is the highest and most perfect, eternal and infinite, all-powerful and all-knowing. He governs everything and knows everything that is or can be done. Music, he controls everything, knows the state of everything, and also knows what can be done in the future. Newton also says it is allowed by that supreme God to exist necessarily, and by the same necessity, he always and everywhere exists. Here, Newton's most profound philosophical point comes out. Newton says God exists necessarily. Now, when Newton says necessarily, that's not a simple thing. In philosophy, necessary existence means the being that. Not existing is impossible, and the entire universe depends on that necessary existence. That's why everything in the created world is called contingent existence. Music and God is the necessary existence. Among all the philosophical arguments for God's existence, one of the strongest is the argument from contingency. Many philosophers have talked about this. One very influential philosopher, who was a contemporary of Newton, discussed this argument in detail. On my channel, I have talked about this contingency argument. There's a version described, which is famous argument. In it shows that God is necessary existence, what's called al in Arabic. You can also check out the video on Aristotle's argument from motion, or the unmoved mover on my channel. Watching both those videos will give you a good idea of the philosophical arguments for the existence of the Creator. You'll find both videos in my God playlist. But Newton sums all this up in just one sentence. All that diversity of natural things that you find suited to different times and places arise from nothing but the ideas and will of a being necessarily existing. In other words, all the diversity and variety we see in this natural world exist because of that necessary existence. That is, because of God's will. Once God exists, he is all similar. All eye, all ear, all brain, all arm, all power to perceive, understand, and act. But in a way that is not human, not corporeal, and not known to us like Newton said here. He's clearing up the confusion by saying that God sees, hears, understands, and feels everything. But when we hear this, many of us tend to compare God to human nature. So Newton says, but in a way not at all. God is not human in any way, not at all corporeal in any way, utterly foreign to us. In other words, God does everything, but nothing about God is like a human being. How God does it is completely unknown to us and can't be compared to anything human. Newton continues, saying God is totally without any body or physical form. God can't be seen, heard, touched, or imagined as any physical form. In other words, you can't picture God as a body or any bodily figure like us. So we won't be able to see, hear, or touch God. And most importantly, he says you can't make any pictures or statues and worship those as God. So you can't use any symbols, idols, or statues to represent God for worship. Didn't I just say that a moment ago? Newton didn't see his role as a scientist just as a scientific duty. To him, it was more like a religious responsibility. One of the most groundbreaking books in the history of science is the It laid down the mathematical foundation of classical mechanics, where we got the laws of motion and gravity. Do you know why Newton wrote this book? His goal was to promote belief in God and to reflect on humanity. In other words, Newton wanted this book to help thoughtful people believe in a creator. Anyway, let's get back to that part at the end of the book about general scholium that we were talking about earlier. Newton clearly says about the law of gravity that we can explain the phenomena of the heavens and our sea by the power of gravity, but we haven't yet figured out the cause of this power. In other words, Newton is saying that he has explained how gravity works in the natural world. This can be explained very clearly with math. But where this power of gravity actually comes from, that's still a mystery. He couldn't figure out the reason behind it. Newton also wrote, "But hitherto I have not been able to discover the cause of those properties of gravity from phenomena, and I frame no hypotheses." Based on observation and experiments, Newton mathematically showed that gravity can be explained accurately. But what is the fundamental cause or foundation of gravity or space? In other words, why does gravity exist? He couldn't find that out through observation and experiments. And since he couldn't discover it that way, so he didn't want to make a claim about why gravity exists based on insufficient information. That's why he said his famous line, "Hypotheses," which means I frame no hypotheses. In other words, he didn't want to accept anything based on mere guesswork as science. Now, you might wonder, if Newton didn't want to say anything without observation and experiment, then what about when he talked about the Creator earlier? Well, God is the ultimate cause of everything. He created the universe and its natural laws. So no, there's not much point in saying that God did something separately, especially when we're looking for a scientific explanation. Looking for a scientific explanation means trying to figure out how God designed that process or system. So instead of saying God did something separately, science focuses on finding the natural explanation behind it. That's what Newton believed too. See, one mistake we often make is that when we hear science hasn't yet found answers to certain things, we immediately say, then, that was done by the Creator. Look, this kind of explanation is really dangerous, especially when you're commenting on something in the natural world that can be understood through observation and experiments. And if science progresses a bit more, it might actually find the answer. This kind of thinking is called the God of the gaps. It means you're trying to put God in the places where science hasn't found answers yet. Don't do that. If you do, then as science advances more and more, the more you think about God in your mind, the less limited his scope actually is. Remember, God is the ultimate cause of everything. He created the universe and the laws of nature. God isn't just a God of the gaps. Our God is the God of the whole show. So whatever we know or science has discovered so far is part of the ultimate cause, which is God. And whatever we don't know yet, or what science might discover in the future, or might never discover, God is still the ultimate cause behind it all. God created this universe. God is the universal ruler who established the natural laws of this universe. When we do science, our job is to discover those natural laws and use them to make new inventions that can benefit humanity. Since God created this universe and set up its natural laws, he isn't controlled by those laws. In other words, God isn't governed by the natural laws of our world. Instead, he designed and set the regular patterns of those natural laws in the universe. So God, if you want, you can do something that we call miraculous or supernatural. That is, God can do things that people like you and me, with our limited abilities, simply can't. That's why God is called Almighty. If he worked like us, or like the natural laws that run this universe, he wouldn't be almighty. So miracles or supernatural events can only happen if the great Creator wills it. And if you accept the great Creator as almighty, Then you'll understand this too. What seems like a miracle or impossible to you and me isn't a miracle or impossible for the Creator. That's exactly why even extraordinary scientific minds like Newton had no trouble believing that, by the Creator's will, miracles or supernatural events can happen. According to Newton, the order and design the Creator set for this universe is something science works to gradually discover and explain. But right now, it's important to clear up one key thing: the existence of God, that is, whether the Creator exists or not, is not a scientific question. It's a question of philosophy of religion. The questions that physics can't answer are discussed in a branch of philosophy called metaphysics. In other words, the existence of God isn't a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question, because you can't find God by doing experiments in a lab. So God is beyond the scope of science. Science deals with the natural world. To understand God's existence, you need to study religious texts, philosophy of religion, and metaphysics. But now you might say, hey, there are a lot of things in religious texts. This is what science is now starting to prove. So does that mean science can't prove the existence of a Creator? Years ago, when there was no modern science, could anyone have said all this without believing in a Creator? You see, that's a really strong argument, and I agree with you. But I'll talk about that in another video. Today's video isn't about that. Today, I'm talking about scientific experiments and observations. Like conducting experiments in a scientific lab or using a telescope. You won't find God through science, because God is beyond the scope of science. We need to clearly understand that science deals with the natural, observable universe. And in that natural, observable universe, we can see signs of the Creator's glory. But we can't see the Creator through a telescope. Many of us often think that all knowledge comes from science, but that's completely wrong. We have to remember that science is definitely one important source of knowledge, but it's not the only source. We'll talk more about which others in a bit. Science can't answer every question. There are some questions science will never be able to answer, those that lie completely beyond the boundaries of science. I'll talk more about those in detail a bit later. When Newton talked about the Creator, he was speaking from his deep philosophical understanding. Newton said God is a necessary existence. So you can see that Newton wanted to keep his scientific explanations within the realm of science and didn't want to give any hypothesis or assumption-based explanation for why gravity exists, because later on, as science progresses further, if there's any natural explanation for this, it could be found. So Newton was very careful not to say something like God of the gaps. From earlier explanations, we see that for Newton, God meant the universal ruler. In other words, the Creator who made everything, sustains it and manages it, the ultimate cause or God beyond the limits of science. So doing scientific experiments means trying to understand that world created by God. That's why Professor Rob named his book about Newton, The Priest of Nature. I'll say it again. Science is a source of knowledge, but not the only one. So we saw that Newton took knowledge from wherever he needed. Sometimes science, sometimes philosophy, sometimes religion. Science keeps moving forward and will keep advancing even more. Back in Newton's time, there were lots of things we didn't know that we do now. But the philosophical lesson you should remember from today's discussion is this: description doesn't create something out of nothing. It itself has no power. So no matter how much science advances, philosophically, the truth will always remain. So when someone explains a process or a law to you and says, "Look, we know the law, we know the process, we don't need God," you should know what question to ask them. The question you need to ask is, where did this law come from? And where did the things that this law applies to come from? And where did those things come from? So what's the ultimate cause of everything? Also, there's another concept we talked about earlier that we should keep in mind. That philosophical concept is called X. Nothing comes from nothing. So, where did everything ultimately come from? The answer is, God created everything with will and power. In our society, there are some people who try to say that no scientific person can actually believe in a creator. That's why I gave an example using Newton music. But it's important to clarify one thing here. No matter how brilliant or influential a person is, when we learn something from them or accept something from them, we will use our own sense and reasoning to accept only what makes sense. We need to remember that God is the foundation and source of all knowledge. So no matter which country, community, religion, or worldview the knowledge comes from, you and I will accept it. When you take knowledge from someone, you're only taking the parts that make sense. You're not worshiping that person. In this video, I'm going to talk about a lot of people whose life philosophies don't match mine, with whom I disagree on many things, but as much as we'll accept what's reasonable using our own judgment, not blindly. Now let's move on to the second part of the video, where we'll be joined by probably the most influential scientist of our time, Stephen Hawking, who supported atheism. Stephen Hawking held the same chair at Cambridge University that Sir Isaac Newton once held. Without a doubt, Stephen Hawking was an extremely brilliant and influential scientist. On top of that, he made incredible contributions to science while battling his physical illness. He became a well-known figure all over the world. When such a prominent scientist says things like, "The universe created itself from nothing," or "There is no God," you can imagine the kind of impact that has on ordinary people like you and me. See, the idea that the universe just came into existence on its own, that it came from nothing. These kinds of ideas have been around among atheists in human society, more or less, throughout the ages. Stephen Hawking didn't really say anything new. But because he said it, think about the kind of attention it gets and how it affects the religious beliefs of everyday people. It's obvious that this might come off as a bold statement. But what Stephen Hawking actually said is what we're going to talk about now. And for that, we need to open up Stephen Hawking's famous book, The Grand Design. Right at the start of the book, Hawking makes a pretty daring claim that's almost like shooting himself in the foot. He says philosophy is dead. See, Stephen Hawking was a scientist who later in the book argues that there's no need for a creator. And that's how he kicks off the whole book. Saying philosophy is dead is like shooting yourself in the foot because it shows that no matter how great a scientist Stephen Hawking was, his knowledge of philosophy was actually pretty limited. When Hawking said philosophy is dead, he meant that questions once answered by philosophy are now answered by science. One big question he referred to is whether the universe needs a creator. But as we discussed earlier, this question actually falls outside the realm of science. To understand this, you need to study more. Religious scriptures. You need to study the philosophy of religion. You need to study metaphysics. So by saying philosophy is dead, he's actually showing his own weakness in philosophy. By the way, one thing should be made very clear here. He is a highly respected scientist. As a pure scientist, his work is brilliant, and there's no doubt about that. We're not even discussing that. Music, but when he, as a scientist, claims he can answer the big questions of another field, like philosophy and he started off by saying philosophy is dead, which was a pretty childish thing to say. Martin, the president of the Royal Society and another brilliant scientist from Cambridge University, said in an interview with The Independent that Stephen Hawking is a remarkable person whom he's known for 40 years. For that reason, any statements from him that sound like predictions are often just exaggerated publicity. So Martin is basically saying he's known Stephen Hawking for 40 years, and he admits that Hawking is an extraordinary person, but we should also be a bit. As I mentioned and admitted earlier, Martin says that when Stephen Hawking says something, it gets way more publicity than usual. Martin also says, I know Stephen Hawking well enough to know that he has read very little philosophy and even less theology. So I don't think we should really get into his views on this topic. In other words, Martin is saying that he knows Stephen Hawking has barely studied philosophy and even less theology. So Martin is commenting on God or philosophy. We shouldn't give much importance to anything Stephen Hawking said. So let's take a look at his famous quote, where he tries to prove that the universe doesn't need a creator. He said, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Let's break down this famous line and analyze it philosophically. First, he says there is a law like gravity. Meaning, since there is a law like gravity, in the next part he says the universe can and will create itself. From nothing. That means this universe will create itself out of nothing. Right at the start, there's a contradiction. He says, since there's a law like gravity already. If there's a law already, that means something exists. That can't be nothing. If something exists, it's something, not nothing. But in the next line, he says the universe will create itself from nothing. Nothing means there's nothing at all. But at the beginning, he said the law of gravity exists. So this is a contradiction. Because at first he says the law of gravity exists, and then later he says, the universe creates itself out of nothing. Another problem is something we just talked about a moment ago. L is just a description. L itself doesn't have any creative power. That means L can't create anything out of nothing. To put it another way, if you ask the question differently, it's like assuming from the start that the cause is L, like gravity. You're assuming that something like gravity already exists beforehand. So where did this L come from? Who made this L? To ask it a bit differently, he begins by saying that since the L of gravity exists. But what if there's something else? How can there be a law of gravity if nothing exists? Because the law of gravity is a law about something. So if nothing exists, what exactly is the law of gravity a law of? What is it acting upon? Then he goes on to say that the universe can and will create itself from nothing. We'll come back to the nothing part in a bit. Let's focus on the first part for now. The universe can and will create itself. In other words, it's saying the universe can create itself and will actually do so. This is a huge contradiction, basically another. You see clear contradiction here, music. If I say A creates B, that means for it to create B, A must already exist music. Something that doesn't even exist can't create anything else. But now if I tell you it will create itself, that's completely illogical because if it doesn't exist, how can it create anything? Saying something will create itself is like saying a mother gives birth to herself. Now, the universe will create itself saying that is. It means the universe will create itself. That means there was no existence before the universe. If nothing existed before, then how could it create itself? So we have to remember that nothing can create itself. Anyway, let me explain the last word of this line. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. We just talked about how the universe will create itself. That doesn't make sense. Now pay attention to the last word. Hawking says the universe will create itself from nothing. But just a moment ago, I learned another famous philosophical concept, ex music fit, meaning nothing comes from nothing. So here we can see another clear contradiction. You can imagine how many contradictions are packed into just one small line. But the question is, why did Stephen Hawking say the universe created itself from nothing? Basically, in his book The Grand Design, what he called nothing isn't really nothing. He just named it nothing. What he meant by nothing was actually a quantum state, where the laws of physics. He called the state where things are working and there's potential. Nothing, that's what Hawking referred to. But what he called nothing is actually a physical framework. You see, it's not really nothing, It's definitely something. If you want to do a bit of research on your own, the question you'd try to answer is what Stephen Hawking called nothing really absolutely nothing, or is it actually something? And if it is something, then where did that something come from? Instead of solving the problem, he kind of bypassed it. He was trying to answer the question is avoided by avoiding the question. Hawking's proposed scientific model is definitely worth learning. If you want, you can read about the no-boundary model discussed in his book. You'll learn a lot, but we're not saying anything against his science. We're just saying that he hasn't proven that the universe came from absolutely nothing. Look, those of us who believe in a creator, what do we believe? We believe the ultimate cause of everything is the creator. In other words, everything ultimately comes from the creator. That means time, space, mass, and so on. Matter, energy, the physical framework, laws of nature, laws of physics, all of these were ultimately created by the creator, and he is above everything. You see, for a believer, there's really no such thing as absolute nothingness. Because even when nothing existed, the creator was still their music, and he created everything. He didn't need any help to create all of this. He created everything through his will and power, and that's why he is almighty. Science's job is to study this created universe, that is, when. Science started from there, so if we go back to the very beginning of our observable universe, right to the start of the Big Bang, we'll see that the universe was once incredibly tiny, even smaller than a proton. But that tiny state wasn't nothing. From that tiny state, the universe expanded to what it is today. When some atheist says that the universe came from nothing, what they really mean is that the universe just appeared out of nowhere without any cause. But science doesn't support that idea. It's impossible to prove because you can't go back before creation. So as long as science can observe or experiment, it will always be dealing with something within this created world. No matter how tiny, microscopic, or unfamiliar it is. So it's definitely not nothing. It's definitely something. And right there, one of the most important questions in the history of philosophy stands. Why is there something rather than nothing? But science will never fully answer this question. Science keeps moving forward and will continue to do so. The more science advances, the more we move forward, the more we'll learn about a lot of conditions in the universe that we usually don't see in our everyday lives. But scientists can observe, measure, and experiment with many of these things in their labs. Now, the question we need to calmly try to answer is, as long as scientists can observe, measure, and experiment with a certain state in their labs, can they draw conclusions and make predictions from that? Can you call that state nothing, no matter how different it is from what we see or face in our daily lives? No, you definitely can't call it nothing. It's definitely something. And if it's something, why does that something exist? Where did it come from? We haven't found the answer to that question. In other words, it's one of the most important and toughest questions in the history of philosophy. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Like, why can't there just be nothing? Why does anything exist at all? Why is there something instead of nothing? We didn't get this explanation from Hawking. So you can see the brilliant scientist Stephen Hawking's explanation. Like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, is not really acceptable. Because what he called nothing isn't actually nothing. After Hawking's book The Grand Design was published, scientists like Roger also said that the book was misleading. Theory. Since there's no direct observational evidence for it, Roger is reluctant to even call it science. Anyway, I don't want to give my own opinion in this scientific debate. I'm just presenting the matter to you. For those who do know Sir Roger, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020. After Stephen Hawking's book The Grand Design was published, at an event Roger said, "Not 10, 500 views, one loud laughter." Anyway, we have to keep in mind that Stephen Hawking's model or theory, even if there's ever any observational evidence or proof, that still doesn't mean the universe came from nothing. Professor John from Oxford University explained just how ridiculous, laughable, and philosophically weak Stephen Hawking's claim that gravity allows the universe to create itself from nothing is. In other words, he says that no matter how much Stephen Hawking writes, it's still nonsense. Professor didn't just call this statement ridiculous, he said it was 3 times more ridiculous. He said that because this short sentence contains 3 contradictions. But when a scientist like Stephen Hawking says the universe will create itself from nothing, people like you and me, ordinary folks who will never read this book or think deeply or philosophically about it, will get confused by what a scientist like Hawking says. They'll think the universe just came into existence out of nowhere, and that philosophy is dead. Stephen Hawking passed away in 2018, but Cambridge University still teaches philosophy today. It's one of the best universities in the world. Like we said before, Stephen Hawking was an incredibly brilliant scientist. You can learn a lot about science from him. But when it comes to talking about philosophy or religion, it's better to just avoid that. Still, you can't really avoid it completely. Since Stephen Hawking was so influential, a lot of people followed the path he took. Another well-known person in this area is the atheist Professor Lawrence. Professor Lawrence wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. You get it right. It's totally straightforward. Just like you and me, regular folks might see the book's title and think the universe just popped into existence out of nowhere. The universe came from nothing. We talked about this a bit earlier. When scientists say nothing, they don't actually mean absolute nothingness. The nothing they're referring to is definitely something. Philosophers usually suggest calling this state not nothing, but quantum vacuum instead. That way, there's no confusion or misunderstanding. But over time, as things go on, it actually gets way more complicated. You see, science deals with physical stuff that can be observed, experimented on, or measured. So when we talk about something in the universe, what we call something in English, that something is physical. And nothing means absolutely nothing at all. But Professor Lawrence tries to say in his book that if something is physical, then nothing has to be physical too. So you get what he means by nothing isn't exactly what we usually think it is. They're trying to change it and use it their own way to say that the universe came from nothing. An easy way to understand this is from a childhood saying we used to hear, "Nobody's perfect, I'm nobody, so I'm perfect." You get it, nobody means no one. So no one is perfect. What you did was put yourself in the place of nobody. But you're not actually nobody. Instead, you redefined nobody, put yourself there and said, "I'm perfect." Basically, since you can't prove you're perfect, you twisted the meaning to make it seem like you are. What you did was change the definition of nobody and put yourself in that spot. Similarly, since Professor Lawrence can't prove that the universe came from nothing, what he did was change the definition of nothing. He's basically redefining nothing. Let's see what he writes in his book. Surely nothing is just as physical as something, especially if it's defined as the absence of something. In other words, he's saying if something is physical, then nothing is physical too. I was watching a debate between 2 Oxford University professors. One of them is an atheist, the other is a believer. Throughout the whole debate, they didn't agree on anything. The only thing they agreed on was the line I just read to you. And their opinion is that this line is nonsense. Pause for a moment, music. Professor Lawrence wrote in his book The Universe from Nothing that, when he speaks at various public forums, religious scholars and philosophers tell him he doesn't really understand what nothing means as a scientist. But you, me, and all of us actually know pretty well. Professor Lawrence knows very well what nothing means. But he actually doesn't want to understand it. Because nothing means absolute nothingness or absolute non-being, and if he accepts that, he wouldn't be able to write a book with that title. For example, he named the 9th chapter of his book, Nothing is Something. In the first line of that chapter, I saw he even admitted that Newton is the greatest physicist of all time. Then he started saying that because of Newton's discoveries, the importance of God has actually diminished. But as we discussed from the very beginning, there's actually no scientific basis for this claim. David Albert, a philosophy professor and an expert in the philosophical foundations of physics, wrote a review of Professor Lawrence's book The Universe from Nothing for the New York Times. I'll drop the link in the description box. You can check it out. After reading it, you'll see just how weak Professor's position really is. Also, there's a famous debate online between Hamza and Professor. I'll add that link in the description box too. If you want, you can watch the whole thing. If you listen to the debate, you'll see just how shaky Professor Lawrence's philosophical foundation really is. Just to remind you, I'm not criticizing Professor's science. I've read the book, and some parts were actually useful. I learned a few things. But the problem is when there's an attempt to slap on a catchy title, or push a metaphysical, philosophical, or religious conclusion that isn't necessarily true. That just creates confusion for people. We often hear around us that science is. Neutral truth should come from the scientific method and observation. But we have to remember that the results from scientific observation and experiments aren't always explained or interpreted in a neutral way by people. By now, you've probably realized that science has nothing to do with atheism. However, in today's world, there's this narrative trying to push the idea that if you believe in science, you can't believe in a creator. But what we really need to keep in mind is that what a scientist says, everyone. But in this field, that's not science. We really need to understand this difference clearly. Music also, right now, there's another problem on our planet. Many people claim that science is the only source of knowledge. They say scientific proof is the only proof. Anything that doesn't come from science, they won't accept. This idea was actually expressed by. He said, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. In other words, meant, science can only discover what humanity can know. Sounds nice, right? But the problem is, he messed up big time. This kind of argument is called a self-defeating argument, which means if what you're saying is true, then what you're saying is actually false. What does that mean? It means when he says humanity can only know what science discovers, he's basically saying the truth only comes from science and nothing else is true. It won't come, and we won't accept any knowledge except that. Now the question is, his claim that what science can't discover, mankind can't know, is that a scientific statement? Did this statement come from science? In other words, was what he said discovered through observation and experiments in a scientific lab? No, it was. Since this isn't a scientific statement or discovery, should we accept it? Because for something to be knowledge, it definitely has to be. It has to come from science. It has to be scientific knowledge. Now you're probably starting to see why this is a self-defeating argument. In other words, if we accept what he says, that we won't accept anything unless it comes from science, then we can't even accept what he's saying. Wrote about this self-defeating and illogical point in his book The Religion and Science. So let's read the full quote and see if the sources of knowledge science relies on actually hold up. Writes, I conclude that while it is true that science cannot decide questions of value, that is because you can't intellectually decide anything at all and lie outside the realm of truth and falsehood. Whatever knowledge is acceptable must be supported by scientific methods, and what science can't discover, humans can't know. If you pay a little attention, you'll see starts by talking about value. I'll get to that in a bit. First, let's talk a little about his idea of knowledge. According to him, science tells us what is true and what is false. C was an atheist who said there is no knowledge beyond scientific knowledge. And again, he also says that for something to be knowledge, it has to be true. You see, I agree with him on that. For something to be knowledge, it definitely has to be true. So let's now look at how well science can reveal the truth. Science studies the universe and tells us the truth about it. But to accept that what science tells us is the truth, that it's reality, we first have to be sure and prove that this universe is real. Now, if someone comes along and says this universe is actually a video game, and you and I are part of that game. Each character in a game, along with the instructions set by that video game, shapes how you and I think. Since we think according to those instructions, we consider our thoughts logical and believe them to be true. Now, this person actually challenges our fundamental beliefs in two ways. The first question that hits us is this universe real? And the second question that comes to mind is, do we really have the ability to think? Is it really logical? Or are we just like characters in a video game, thinking and acting only based on the instructions we've been given, believing that's the reality? Okay, let's get back to that question. But now the question is, can science definitively prove that this universe is real? The answer is no. Science can't definitively prove that this universe is real. Science just assumes the universe is real and works from there. But proving that the universe is actually real, that's beyond science. No way. Anyway, if you're not convinced by what I'm saying, you can check out the third chapter of Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design. The chapter is called, What is Reality? Now, let me go back to what I was saying earlier. These days, in both science and philosophy, a lot of people are asking if we're actually living in a simulation. Simply put, a simulation is like a video game where each of us is a character. So everything we see around us and ourselves, none of what we think about reality is actually real. You see, people have always had these kinds of doubts. But nowadays, Nick's simulation hypothesis has become way more well-known. Even one of the most influential people today, Elon Musk, believes that there's a good chance we're living in a simulation, or that our reality is actually a simulation. In other words, what we consider to be real might not be real at all. Maybe someday we'll have a detailed discussion about this simulation hypothesis. But the main point is whether our universe is real or not. No science can prove whether we're living in a simulation or not. The funny thing is, according to, you can't believe anything without scientific proof. What science can't discover, humanity can't know. So if we accept that, then we can't even say for sure that this universe is real. That raises the question, since science can't prove if this universe is real, are the things we discover inside it, the things we accept as true, actually real? Can we really take them as real? Is there any scientific basis for skepticism? In the future, when we discuss epistemology and the philosophy of science on this channel, we'll dive deeper into these topics. But when you ask questions like, is this universe real? Or are we living in a simulation? These kinds of scary doubts aren't new at all. The philosopher who really made these ideas famous was the French thinker Descartes. He decided to doubt everything in the world that could possibly be doubted. By doubting everything, he eventually find a foundation of knowledge that absolutely can't be doubted. Many consider that statement the most famous line in the history of philosophy. And that famous line is the cogito ergo sum, which in English means, I think, therefore I am. In Bangla, it translates roughly to, since I am thinking, therefore I exist. Now, you might wonder how such a simple statement became the most famous line in philosophy. If so, you should watch the video I made. Music, here you'll learn. You'll understand why he started doubting everything and how he proved his own existence. Anyway, Descartes is called the father of modern philosophy. He got rid of his destructive doubt when he saw God, and according to him, God is the foundation of all knowledge. In his book Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes writes that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depend on the knowledge of the true God alone, so much so that before I discovered that I couldn't have perfect knowledge of anything else at all. In other words, he's saying that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends solely on the knowledge of the one true God. And it depends on that so much that before discovering this knowledge, I can't gain exact knowledge of anything else. Basically, Descartes is saying that if you don't believe in God, then you can't really believe in this world either, because there's no foundation to trust in the world without the Creator. Everything starts from the source of all truth. I discussed this part from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, published by Oxford University Press. If you're interested in learning more about Descartes' ideas, you should definitely check out this book. You see, it's something to really think deeply about. No matter how powerful we think we are as humans, we don't even have the ability to prove something very basic. Like, is the universe we live in real? Or is it just some video game made by someone else? We don't have the ability to prove things scientifically, because we use the scientific method to discover stuff within the universe. But we can't step outside the universe to observe it from the outside. That's beyond our capability. This limitation reminds us how small we really are. Just like the Creator who can observe everything from above creation, we don't have that power. That's why we're limited, while the Creator is infinite and all-knowing, having complete knowledge about everything. So his knowledge is complete. His knowledge is objective. Our knowledge is limited. It depends on our restricted understanding. That's why our knowledge is always incomplete. That's also why God sent prophets from time to time, giving us knowledge that humanity didn't have before. Music, that's why Imam said that to live a good life, we need both reason and revelation. Reason means using our logic and intellect, and revelation means believing in the divine guidance sent by God. Imam, he compared revelation to the light of the sun, and reason or intellect to our eyesight. Both are needed to walk the path properly. So we have to keep in mind that Allah has given us the ability to use our reason and intellect. At the same time, we must remember that our reason and intellect have their limits. Therefore, a true believer trusts in the Creator. They believe that this universe created by the Creator is real, and they have faith in the revelation brought by the Prophet. And as a really important part of gaining knowledge, you should study science. While doing that, a believer will also trust that slowly, this pursuit of knowledge will bring them closer to the truth. Since we were talking about science, let's circle back to Stephen Hawking for a moment. He didn't change his condition until he passed away. He was an atheist, meaning he died as a non-believer. Before he died, in his last book, he wrote, "I do not have any grudge against God. Music, I do not want to. I want to make it clear that my work isn't about proving or disproving God's existence. My work is about finding a logical framework to understand the universe around us." In other words, Stephen Hawking said, "I don't have any anger towards God. I don't want people to think my goal is to prove whether God exists or not. That's not my job. My job is to find a rational way to understand the cosmos around us. But as humans, I hope you understand the limits of our reasoning." Nothing left. Anyway, let's go back a bit to what said. He was talking about how science can't discover everything mankind can't know. But just now, we discussed that science can't even prove the universe is real. So if we accept point, does that mean we also have to accept that the universe isn't real? And if the universe isn't real, does that mean everything discovered within it isn't real either? Anyway, let's move away from that topic now. Let's talk about another kind of knowledge now, moral knowledge. See, as a person, the most important things you have are your values, your ethics, your sense of right and wrong, your purpose in life. Can science prove that we should have ethics or morality? Can science prove that human life is valuable? Can science prove that your life has any meaning or purpose? If someone says they don't believe in anything without scientific proof, then do they also not believe that human life has any value? Can science definitely prove what's good or bad? No. If a ruler in your country comes to power and starts killing people at will, can you say scientifically that he has done something wrong? Because science can't prove that human life has any value. Does that mean you'll say from tomorrow that human life really has no value? Let me repeat what I've been saying throughout the video. Science is one source of knowledge, but not the only one. The job of science is to provide natural explanations of the natural world through observation, experiments, and measurements. On the other hand, religion and philosophy are all about answering the big questions in life. What's the ultimate cause of everything? What's the purpose? They help us figure that out. Why does something rather than nothing exist? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? What's the ultimate reality? What's the basis of our morality? That is, the values and ethics that make us human. Science stays completely silent on these questions because they're beyond its scope. But do you believe that science can actually answer those? As humans, we don't really have the ability to say what's genuinely a good or bad deed. In other words, science can't decide what's moral or immoral, so as humans, we don't truly have knowledge of morality. Notice the first line from, he actually says, I conclude it's true that science cannot decide questions of value, because these questions can't be fully figured out intellectually or strictly within the realm of truth and falsehood. Basically is saying that when it comes to ethics and morality, there really isn't a clear-cut answer. There's no such thing as absolute truth or falsehood. Like if one person oppresses another, you can't just say for sure that they did something wrong. Because as humans, supposedly we can't intellectually decide that. But dude, the very ability to tell right from wrong is what makes us human. So the knowledge you and I gain isn't just for making money. That knowledge has meaning, a purpose, a moral direction. That moral direction teaches us to recognize what's ethical and what's not. That's what philosophy is about. In language, we talk about good and evil. But science stays completely silent on questions of morality. Forget all other knowledge in the world. If you and I don't have moral understanding, then we could never truly become human. But that morality is outside the scope of science. Science cannot tell us what is good and what is evil. You're right when you talk about the moral foundation of science, but you can't turn around and talk about the scientific foundation of morality. In other words, you can discuss the moral basis of science, but not the scientific basis of morality. There's no such thing as a solid foundation. That phrase, whose is it? Be sure to comment and let me know. By the way, music, here's a quick note. Some people say science is the source of all knowledge. This kind of belief is called scientism. It's not a good thing. Nowadays, scientism is seen in a negative light. If you don't want to come off as ignorant, you should read up a bit on what scientism really is. And don't go around saying that scientists are the source of all knowledge. The moral framework or ethical standards of human society have always come from religion. Later on, moral philosophy contributed to that as well. Knowledge of morality doesn't come from science. So you can understand why statement about what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know, isn't something to take seriously. It's a self-defeating argument. Also, let me tell you something else. That point made actually has a history. In the last century, a movement started called logical positivism. It might sound one way, but it's not really like that. Maybe I'll talk about logical positivism in detail in a future video. For now, to make it simple, You can think of positivism here as empiricism. In other words, the main idea of those who supported logical positivism was that they wouldn't accept anything beyond observation, empirical evidence, or scientific verification, just like said. But as we saw earlier, his own argument was self-defeating. Plus, science itself sometimes fails to meet the verification principle. Also, we've already realized that science isn't the only source of knowledge. So then what? You can get knowledge about ethics, morality, metaphysics, and many other things from different sources. So, as you can see, on one hand, the core principles of logical positivism are self-defeating. On the other hand, if you think about it from the perspective of knowledge, it's really narrow-minded. That's why, around the 1960s, the logical positivism movement gradually faded away due to its failure. So even today, in 2025 or 2026, if someone tells you that science is the only source of knowledge, you should be able to understand that person is actually stuck in the last century. People are walking around carrying temporary misconceptions and failed beliefs in their hearts. We just talked about another terrible problem in our world today. That problem is that many people try to replace God with the law of nature or the law of physics. In other words, at different times, different people show us various laws or processes and say, "Look, we've discovered this law or this process." So now we supposedly know how the universe operates and functions. At that point, what we really need to do is, it should be said that, yeah, this is exactly how it's supposed to be. I mean, the Creator set up order and design within the universe just like this. And science's job is to find that order, design, and those laws. Let me say that from the start again. We don't believe in a God of the gaps. We don't believe in a God who becomes irrelevant the moment science discovers something. As much as we understand this universe, that's exactly how much the Creator made and runs it. And as much as we don't understand, that much is still true too. God created everything and is still running the show. Our God isn't some God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole universe. And we've already talked about how you can't create something out of nothing. So laws of nature are just descriptions of how things naturally work. They're not the cause. One of the most influential philosophers of the century was Ludwig. He also came from Cambridge University. He said that, at the core, the whole modern view of the world is an illusion based on natural laws and explanations of natural phenomena. See, this is exactly what we've been talking about throughout the whole video. People keep telling us, or trying to make us understand, that everything happening is following the law of nature, and that's the reason behind everything. But the law of nature isn't really the cause of everything. The law of nature just explains that things happen according to a certain pattern, that there's some regularity inside everything. But where does this law of nature come from? What's the ultimate cause behind it? Science can't tell us that. So we have to. Nature is being explained and then stopped right there. And they say, look, this is the explanation. There's no God involved. I hope by now you've understood that the law of nature is not the ultimate explanation. It's just a description, not the cause. The ultimate explanation is the one that answers the question. Where did everything really come from? Who did it come from? And we have to keep in mind that God is that ultimate explanation, the necessary existence. If we can get that into our heads, then we've actually found the answer to that question. Nothing comes from nothing. In other words, everything in the universe, no matter how tiny or minuscule, has an explanation. That explanation is God. God is the necessary existence on which everything in the universe depends. From today's video, I hope you've understood that there's actually no real conflict between religion and science. They're just two different sources of knowledge. In today's world, science is extremely important, and we definitely need to gain knowledge about it. We need to practice science, and our religion actually encourages us to do that. The knowledge of the Creator is the source of all other knowledge in the world. So we have to remember not to limit our understanding just to scientific or philosophical knowledge. On our journey of thinking and learning, we'll come across many talented people and get the chance to learn a lot from them. But we must keep in mind not to lose sight of the ultimate purpose of our life. That's why Newton wrote something in his notebook. He wrote it down, and we can also jot something like that in our notebooks. But it could be a little different or a bit bigger than Newton. Like Plato is a friend, Aristotle is a friend, Newton is a friend, Hawking is a friend. But the truth is my greatest music friend. I'm just throwing out an idea. Make sure to comment what you'd write in your notebook. See you in the next video.